But can you talk a bit about yeah, you see this relationship between Hegelian philosophy and American pragmatism, but then also, as you mentioned, what someone like a Terry Pinkett would be trying to do in trying to like draw these lines or have these threads between the two, ostensibly totally different ways of thinking or ways of doing philosophy.
Sure. Yeah, I can do my best there. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, Hegel has had a presence in America since the mid 19th century, and it was due to Hegel's earliest sort of presence in America that I think the young John Dewey came into, a familiarity with Hegel. You may, I don't know if you're aware of it, but John Dewey was he received his undergraduate degree at the University of Vermont, and the University of Vermont was really one of the first places, at least as far as I know. I mean, the early sort of reception of Hegel in the U.S. I think it was this group called the Vermont Hegelians who had, to my mind, and I may be, again, people in the comment sections may correct me or know better than I do, but as far as I'm aware, the earliest that I know of is the Vermont Hegelians responding to Hegel. And so there's a well established school of study of Hegel at the time in which John Dewey studied there. And so, the connection to, um, the connections between, Dewey and Hegelianism begin there, and they certainly don't end there. And that's one of the things that I think, Pinkert is trying to talk about in that uh, element that he wrote for our series. Um, yeah, it off, and I mean, yeah, it's been one of sort of waxing and waning since that point. I mean, pragmatism is aligned with the aims of analytic philosophy to a great extent, and analytic philosophy is had, to put it mildly, an antipathy towards Hegel for much of its, uh, much of its duration, um, and yeah, but I think that again, a lot of what they were, I mean, and this is what sort of fascinates me about what Pinkert and Pippin were able to do. And one of the sort of early things that I caught on to in reading Hegel was that I just felt like the early analytic philosophers, when they would attack Hegel, they were really attacking a straw man. And it felt to me as though they didn't really understand the commitments of idealism, the commitments to idealism that Hegel was making, in any sort of profound sense, and that there were ways in which they were sort of simplifying the argument. Again, the sort of straw man arguments, right? Like, you know, associating Hegel with the claim essayist Percippi, for instance, as G.E. Moore does. Like, this doesn't sound like Hegel. Hegel would never say anything like that, and that's certainly not one of his more profound commitments by any means, right? This is not if that's idealism, then Hegel is not an idealist, right? Um, so I think that as I mean, there have been some sort of course corrections that have happened in the work, and that's why I think that Pippin and Pinkard, their work remains so influential and so important for all of us to engage with, even as it's going on 30 odd years since the publication of some of their central texts. But uh, their work remains important because of the kind of course corrections that they can offer, right? I mean, this is a way to start to understand idealism as you know not uh I don't know, a uh you know metaphysically, I'm searching for words here, but there's a kind of like metaphysically sloppy or metaphysically uh grandiose theory in need of correction, in need of minimization, that needs to be reined in or anything like that. Hegel is himself, I mean, sort of minimally committed to things, and he's in the sense that I think that he's very careful to sort of move through at a very deliberate pace through his various commitments.
He's a modest
And
philosopher. He's a
yeah,
modest
he's a modest
philosopher
for all of
in many
his,
ways.
for all of
Yeah.
his boldness in speaking, in rhetoric. He is a very modest philosopher. That's a good way to put the point. So, you know, um, I think that we all need to understand, what is meant by idealism. And I think that, what Pippin does so well is he understands idealism in line with the sort of apperception thesis in Kant of the, consciousness of an object is, all consciousness is self-consciousness, right? And this is itself, again, a profound commitment. It's even this has been subject to, kinds of ridicule that people try to, say, well, it's unrealistic, it's implausible to say that in being conscious of an object, I'm conscious of myself at the same time. And Pippin has been very good over the years of responding to saying that's not quite what it means to say that all consciousness is self-consciousness, right? It's just to say that, like, I am self-consciously conscious of objects, right? Or, something in sort of that vein. I forgot the way that he put it in a recent article, but um, this is, these are insights that I think remain important for us, um, as we grapple with the insights of idealism. And I think that, yeah, I mean, as we've progressed, I mean, we start to see a sort of return. It's not, again, by accident that people like Brandom and McDowell come back to um, Hegel once these course corrections have been put in place, right? There's a reason why, Pippin and Pinkert are central to the work that they've produced, that Brandom and McDowell have produced. Um, so, uh, yeah. In any case, I think that the important connections between, ideal, like Hegel and pragmatism today, I think have to do with this notion of that this is to get more to the point of your question.
In fact, if I may just add a bit here,
Yeah.
perhaps if I could say, for a naive reader like myself who hasn't read a lot of American pragmatism, nor the work of Pippin, a little bit of Pinkert, just on the realm of philosophical ideas, where do you see these two schools meeting, if I could put that, or certain intersections or convergences, so to
Yeah.
speak?
Right.
And that's kind of where I was trying to get at
I
with that
see. I
question.
see. Well, yeah, I think, for one, um, I think that, where we see convergence, the the biggest place where I see convergence is that, every sort of serious attempt to, analytic attempt to engage Hegel has to begin with the mention of Wilfrid Sellars, right? And a rejection of the so-called myth of the given, right?
Given, yeah.
Yeah. And so, seeing that, like, what Hegel meant by idealism had more to do with this, right? A rejection of immediacy. Um, is I think once that kind of course correction was able to be put in place, I think it allowed for a broad range of responses in a Hegelian vein to occur within the analytic landscape.
If I
Yeah.
can interrupt,
Yeah.
Dr.
Go
Russell,
ahead.
maybe it's worth, again, for the listeners' sake, if you could just briefly highlight what Sellers' myth of given is, because it
Oh, sorry.
is,
So,
it can be
yeah.
a bit of a technical concept to understand.
Oh, that's true. That's true. And I didn't, yeah. So, thanks for pointing that out. So, the myth of the given is this idea that there are, um, in our attempts to know the world, there are certain things that are just brute givens, that we don't need any sort of thought, any sort of premeditation, any sort of, like, intellectual effort to understand, to grasp. And that these kinds of givens, this is a sort of classical empiricism that Sellers is at great pains to reject through the course of his works. But the notion is that these sort of brute givens form ultimate grounds of knowing in the same way that the cogito forms a brute ground of knowing for Descartes, right? These brute givens of experience then form the ground for all other claims to know. Um, Sellers wants to hold on to something that looks like empiricism, but without also giving into this idea that I need to accept. We need to accept the immediacy and the bruteness of what is given alongside that empiricism. So the question then becomes, well, how can um, my knowledge claims be answerable to experience if even the objects that I experience require some kind of thinking. And so that's sort of the core question that Sellers is grappling with, at least in my understanding of Sellers. And that's the sort of core question that animates uh, much of what Brandom and McDowell are doing in Sellers' wake. And so before, Pittsburgh Hegelianism was Pittsburgh Hegelianism, I mean, I think it was really like what drew people like McDowell and Brandom to Pittsburgh in the first place was the legacy of Wilfrid Sellers. If I'm understanding the history correctly, Sellers having been a professor at University of Pittsburgh himself.
That's correct indeed. I just want to add this point again for the listener. In
Sure.
fact, on that point you made about Sellers, I would just mention there's a great chapter by Paul Redding in the Palgrave Hegel Handbook called "The Pittsburgh Neo-Hegelianism of Robert Brandom and John McDowell," and that goes into the history of this, how the Pittsburgh School started, and then eventually the connection between Hegel. And in fact, like you mentioned, Sellers was really almost the founding figure or the founding father of that movement. But just a bit of an introduction there. Please go ahead, Dr. Ritz.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you mentioning that. And I would like to add a plug for Paul Redding, whose work on the Pittsburgh School is really, really outstanding. He wrote a book on it in, I think, 2008 or thereabouts. And his work over the years has continued in that vein of really being able to give a strong and concise and clear understanding of the relationship between, the history of Hegel reception and the history of analytic philosophy. So in any case, what draws Brandom and McDowell to Pittsburgh is really the Sellarsian legacy of like really being invested in this question. Again, how can I understand, how can my knowledge claims be answerable to experience if even my engagements with experience require some kind of engagement with thought? Where I think, insofar as, you can sort of trace these things by means of the philosophical texts. I mean, if that's the framework from which you're beginning, then, again, these course corrections that are given by Pippin and Pinkard really help us to see very clearly that if that's what you're interested in, then Hegel absolutely has to figure at the center of what you are doing, because epistemologically, Hegel is committed to that very same question, and defending an idealism is for Hegel defending that very claim, right? That our knowledge claims can be answerable to an experience that is at the same time always a product of thought. Or, Pippin's way of putting it is to say that our faculty of spontaneity is always shot through with receptivity, or that, there's some sort of fundamental relationship with between intuitions and concepts, right? So in any case, I mean, that's sort of how I see things happening, and it sort of blossoms from there. And of course, Brandom goes on to say a great deal many more things about Hegel, and find much more of interest in Hegel than just a response to the myth of the given. But I have to believe that that's sort of where things really begin.
Yes, in fact, that point you made about intuitions and thought, there's a lot to say there, because like, I would even say, apropos cognitive science, and there are these notions of embodied cognitive science. There's some interesting, you could probably even Hegelianize this very rigid notion of how cognitive science was done since, let's say, Noam Chomsky. And I think a lot of this notion of enactivism, and there are these movements coming up. I can't say much because I haven't really thought about it in any critical way to think of that. And as a matter of fact, I believe Robert Brandom gave a really good talk. I'll put an overlay and I'll share it with you too if you already haven't listened to this, Dr. Red. So it was called a talk. It was titled "How Analytic Philosophy Failed Cognitive Science."
Interesting.
And it was a great talk where he kind of talks about the value of bringing in some of these Hegelian ideas and then even sell us into it. But now, I mean, again, I'm derailing the conversation. Just a little interesting point there.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, and yeah, I would love to learn more. I've done a little bit. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I'll be sure to share it with you. We gave it about, about 15 years ago, a while back. But I do, because you mentioned Brandom. I mean, I'd say from the Pittsburgh School, the person I've read most is perhaps Robert Brandom.
Hmm.
I find him just like a beautiful person to listen to, but also his work is beautifully written.
Hmm.
And it's known, I think, quite well that, Brandom said that his goal is to bring analytic philosophy to its Hegelian face. So,
But just to be
let me
clear,
just
Richard
ask you
Rorty
this.
said that about Brandom. Brandom didn't say that about himself,
Oh,
but
is that right? Okay.
yeah, that's
See
right.
that
That's
I'm
right.
glad you
Yeah.
corrected me. That was some
No,
that
it's
yeah,
fine.
in fact I thought Brandon himself said this, so I read it wrong.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's
But
Rorty who was. Yeah, Rorty had said that. It's fine. It's just a small thing.
yeah, but it's an important historical bit of fact there. But I'm curious, do you think, if I could just ask crudely, or rather crassly, do you think Brandon has succeeded in this project that he didn't say himself was his project, but it seemed like to certain people that was his project?
Yeah, you know, uh, it's a fascinating question. I mean, I've spent a long time. I actually wrote my dissertation on Brandom, and my first few publications were
Indeed, you were saying
uh,
this.
on Brandom, and I've since my views since that time have sort of evolved on Brandom a great deal. I think as I've sort of gone through my reconsiderations of Hegel, I've reconsidered my own relationship to uh, Brandom and Brandom's relationship to Hegel, and I tend to be more charitable to him these days than I was in my early publications. And we can get into reasons why, some of which are yes, but not all that philosophical. But it's hard to evaluate that because I don't know what it would mean for I don't know what it would mean for analytic philosophy to enter into a Hegelian phase. Like I don't know what a Hegelian phase
What
would look
Rorty, or like what Rorty meant by that? Yeah.
right, or what Rorty meant by that when he said that. It's a very difficult. Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult claim to suss out, and like I mean, he said that Sellers brought. I think he was saying that Sellers brought analytic before he said that. I mean, the full quote is that Sellers brought analytic philosophy out of its Humean phase and into its Kantian phase. And then and then it's Brandom who brings it into its Hegelian phase, and I don't know. I mean, it's yeah, it's difficult to say that. I mean, I really don't know a lot about how, and maybe it's just pure ignorance that I'm speaking from here, but I don't know a lot about how Brandom's book has been received um, in analytic circles since its publication. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day. Like well, not the, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Is that I like you. I mean, I really love reading Brandom, and I teach Brandom in every imaginable class. Like whenever I have an excuse to teach Brandom, I'm sure to teach Brandom because I just admire his work so much. Even if over the years I found myself diverging from him. Yeah, he's absolutely brilliant, and you know one of the foremost philosophical minds alive today, and that's I don't think anyone can deny that. Um, the issue is that his book on Hegel is actually a very difficult book. I mean, just the amount of knowledge that it presupposes in order to engage with it is extraordinarily high, right? So I was thinking about this the other day. Like, I would love to teach Brandom's book in an upper level undergraduate seminar or something like that. All right, it would be great to teach A Spirit of Trust, but how do you teach a book like that? Because you have to read it alongside the Phenomenology of Spirit, which itself is a really difficult book. But then you also have to have a kind of distance from the Phenomenology of Spirit or kind of philosophical imagination in order to translate what Hegel is saying, into what Brandom is gaining from it.
Brandomese. Yeah.
Right, right. I mean, so, I mean, Brandom's book is Hegelian in spirit, but I don't think even Brandom would say that it's Hegelian by the letter of the law. Um, you know, so I guess I have to plead. Maybe it's a disappointing answer. I have to plead a little bit of ignorance because I don't know how the how the book has been received in analytic circles, and I have to imagine that the reception of that book, just because it is the barriers towards entry of that book are so high that it's going to be a slow course. That maybe we won't know fully how Hegelian analytic philosophy becomes for another 50 or 75 years, just because, again, and it's not even that. Yeah, the barriers to entry are so high. It's also almost 900 pages, right? So, like, you also have to. It's a significant time investment as well. There are a lot of significant barriers to entry, and I think that it's a book that I think every living philosopher should read. A Spirit of Trust. It's every historians can get a lot from. It's a completely revolutionary historiography of philosophy, um, and philosophers can find so much in there that is relevant to philosophy of language, to social philosophy, to ethics, to um, epistemology. So uh, there's something in that book for everyone, and I think we all need to engage it. But just what the impact of that book, I think we're still in an early phase. I mean, that's what I think I would say definitively, is that it's probably too early to tell at this point. What the successes and failures of that book have been.
Indeed, indeed. I mean, that's a totally fair answer. I mean, also the book only came out in, I think, 2019, so it's not like a book that's been around for 30, 40 years where people have had almost a lifetime to read it. And
Mhm.
when I did say that I've read Brandom, I didn't mean that book. Certainly not. I haven't even
No.
started on. I own it, but I meant more like his journal articles
Yeah,
and just
sure,
journal
sure.
entries and
Mhm.
whatnot.
Yeah.
That reading that book itself would probably be a project that'll take a couple of years at least for
Right.
me.